Welcome to Nerds at Church, a podcast about nerdery and the Bible. I'm Pastor Kay, and I use pronouns like she and her.
And I'm Pastor Emily, and my pronouns are they, them, theirs. In this episode, we'll discuss the fifth Sunday in Lent, which this year falls on March 26th.
Check out the episode description for links to the Bible passages and other references we make in this episode.
So our deep dive for this episode is really buried quite deep. So deep, in fact, that it's cemeteries. Y'all thought you got away without some of the puns last week when we didn't tell you the riddle of I see, said the blind man as he picked up his hammer and saw, but you were wrong. Cemeteries and graves this week.
Yes.
So very exciting.
Somewhat less commonly known as a bury patch or a berry patch, depending on how exactly you pronounce the word bury or bury. Although that guy might have been lying to me, so if it's not a popular term in New Jersey, just let us know.
I was going to say, and if you initially got really confused about why people would call a cemetery a patch of like raspberries and like how
No, it's where you bury people.
Dead bodies were the berries, then
yes,
you are not alone.
Right.
It was not until I read it in our planning document that I was like,
Yep.
Interesting. It is particularly interesting given Cabbage Patch Kids.
I mean, but the whole point of the Cabbage Patch Kids is that they're alive.
Yeah.
When you...
Yeah, but it's like a patch of small...
Like I said, the guy might have been making it
humans.
up. So if it's not popular in New Jersey to call them that, that's fine. But...
yeah. But yes, dear listeners, let us know if you have any other names for cemeteries or graveyards.
Yes.
Whether or not they are fruit related, we would like to know.
Sure. So let's start with some secular cemetery practices and some laws related to cemeteries and graveyards that we are familiar with in the United States because both of us have, spent some time around those places, professionally speaking.
It's almost like it's our jobs.
Yes. So when it comes to burial, and we'll talk about regular burial in a full body casket first, one of the things that people often have questions about is the burial vault, which is often made out of metal or concrete and is lowered into the grave, and it sort of is a wall that goes around the casket, and it supports the ground around the casket in order to keep the land from collapsing in as the body eventually decays, and the casket will collapse under the weight of the earth without such support. And so the vault is a very common practice. There may be states that don't actually require one, but a lot of states do. I think all the states I've worked in have required a vault for burial. And that's just part of making sure that the ground stays basically secure.
That's weird, though, because you would think that the way that caskets are secure these days also, but like that there would be like the casket itself would keep the ground from caving in and stuff too.
Well, that's a lot of dirt, and as the water, seeps into the dirt and then is evaporated out again, the earth actually moves around quite a bit. The casket will actually move over time if you haven't specifically put a vault around it. A little bit, although not a ton. And also, when the burial is finished, you'll remember that usually the cemetery keepers or the grave diggers will leave the ground flat on top. They won't put all of the dirt that came out of the grave back onto that exact spot. They will flatten out the top and take some of the extra dirt away. And that means that there's actually less stuff there than there should be, even with the casket involved. So if you didn't have a vault in there, the ground would eventually turn into a tiny little valley or ditch over the grave as the dirt resettled.
I also remembered, and this might just be from like TV shows and stuff, mounds on top. So that's fascinating.
Well, right. I mean, having visited many graveyards,
yeah,
and so on, including like fairly quickly after a grave is closed up, I've always seen them as having been flattened out. Yeah,
that makes sense. I think my having seen them after is pop culture or long enough after that like grass is growing and that sort of thing. So
Well, and very
that
often
makes sense.
cemeteries will actually encourage the grass to grow faster with lots of fertilizer and stuff, or just put down a strip of sod in order to make the cemetery look pretty as fast as possible, because that's a thing that people care about. So,
Wow. Even in the place where literally we bury the dead, we want to hide death.
yeah,
Huh.
of course. And
Fascinating.
I won't actually go into the story of they had to move my great uncle's grave because of where they decided to put the sprinklers, but lots of weird things happen. I'm just saying. So,
Wow. 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 Yeah, if you
awkward.
want more in like the whole way that we talk about and experience and death and all of that, definitely check out our All Saints episode from last year with
Yes.
Reverend Justin Thornburg, who is a death doula, because that
Mm-hmm.
has lots more of that. But yeah, that's fascinating. Another aspect to burial that is common in the United States is preserving the body. So, a lot of how it is preserved these days is through embalming, and that is something that actually like wasn't common practice until Lincoln was killed, President Lincoln, and then they needed to take his body around to all the different states and prove that he had actually died. And so they embalmed him, and it kind of just took off since then. It's
Sure.
not good for the environment. It's a whole
Yeah.
bunch of chemicals. So it's not good for the environment, and there's movements nowadays, particularly around green burials, to
Yes.
not have any embalming fluids or like any of that sort of a thing. One way to preserve a person's body for a short amount of time would be to freeze it. So that's why morgues have freezers full of bodies. And I know someone who his wife died of cancer and he built a pine wood box coffin for
Sure.
her, and they did everything just from their home. And so they had a quilt that they laid on her, and then they put ice packs in the quilt to keep her body temperature cool for like the wake and
Sure.
that sort of a thing, which was a really cool alternative to embalming fluids, which
Yes.
are, yeah, not so
Although there
cool.
are
Huh?
actually
Teaser
laws
to think.
about how we treat dead bodies and how we keep them in various places, and specifically, oddly enough, the importance of strict record keeping when it comes to dead bodies, including
Mm-hmm.
where a person's body is buried exactly and when they were put there and all of that, because it turns out that people have actually tried to hide the occasional extra body that was moved from life unto death without anyone else's permission, you could say, in graves before, or a lot of other places. But
Mm.
particularly, many people have apparently realized, hey, there's an open grave over there. Wouldn't it be handy if we just,
Just
dropped
like
this extra
toss it
body
in.
into it? And, yeah, and so there are very strict laws about how quickly after a burial the grave has to be filled in, and someone actually has to like be
Mm.
there and make sure it gets filled in without any time of the grave being unattended in many places,
Huh.
and the importance of knowing exactly who is buried where, so that if they get dug up they can figure out, yes, this is the person that was supposed to be buried here, or no, this is not the body that was supposed to be put here, that is incorrect. So that
Yeah,
gets
that's
pretty interesting.
fascinating. A related thing was in the news the other day, which is because of the droughts in Nevada and California, there's a reservoir downstream from Las Vegas and
Mm-hmm.
outside of Los Angeles. And as the water table has dropped, they have discovered bodies multiple
Oh,
times because,
sure.
like, if you
That was a handy place to, dispose of them.
sent someone to swim with the fishes
Right.
from the river closest to Las Vegas, that's where they would end up. I always heard about people doing that with like construction sites where they're going to
Oh, yes.
lay cement.
Absolutely. But I would think that a reservoir would probably be a better choice than, say, a lake, because I believe there are also a lot of rules about a reservoir has to be kept filled up to a certain point.
Mm,
So I can see the choice there too.
yeah, yeah, that would make sense. That's also like exhuming bodies. There's a lot of rules around too, right?
Oh, yeah.
There are mysteries that have been solved on TV by exhuming bodies and like finding out that like, oh, maybe the Pope was poisoned because the tongue is this color. So extra reasons to keep good records. And it means that like there are a lot of congregations that have cemeteries that are older cemeteries. In the middle of my middle school, it moved from downwind of the sewage treatment plant to next door to a cemetery. But it was a really old cemetery. It wasn't in use anymore, but they still had to
Sure.
have, like, whoever owned the land still had to have the records and all of that stuff.
Yeah.
One of the other rules around burial is that you are supposed to, as we all know, bury people 6 feet under.
At least.
At least. And I think I had always heard that that was like so that wild animals don't like smell them and then dig them up.
Sure.
But there is a different place where it came from, which is 1665 in London during the Black Plague, where it was like there were pamphlets that they had of like proper burial practices, presumably to keep people safe as they buried people who had died from the Black Plague.
Well, and specifically to make sure that wild animals didn't dig up the bodies and then spread the Black Plague further too.
Okay. Yeah. 6 feet was determined to be the height at which someone who was digging could still toss the dirt up and would not need a ladder to get out.
So you'd have that great upper body strength from all that digging. Absolutely.
Yep.
And then more recently in human history, cremation has become a very common practice. And these days, I believe it's almost as popular as burial in the traditional sense.
Yeah. And there's a movement of like, it's more environmentally friendly than putting all the chemicals in the ground, which is true. It's not more environmentally friendly than burying someone without all the chemicals because you're using you're creating a lot of carbon and using a lot of stuff to burn an entire body up. And one of the things about cremation in particular is that there is a required waiting time in most places. It depends a little bit between places, and it also depends on if someone was like in hospice and had cancer and like they expected the person to die versus an unexpected death. But when my grandmother died, I think my grandmother and my grandfather maybe, they had a like waiting period where you couldn't cremate the person right away. You had to wait at least like 24 hours or 30, like some amount of time, just in case there was like some sort of criminality behind it or malicious intent so you weren't burning the evidence.
Yeah, because apparently during the early days of cremation, people also found out that that was very convenient. It is amazing how many of the burial practices that we have are based on, and murderers found that helpful. So,
which is a great time to remind everyone,
murder bad. Also, having gone through this experience in my family, I would just like to take a moment to talk about ways that you can spread ashes without accidentally horrifying onlookers. For example, if you are spreading ashes from a plane, look up an article on how to do it, or else you will accidentally have the ashes flung back from the wind going by the plane onto your other loved ones who are very much alive, and they will be horrified. If you are spreading ashes and there is a strong wind and you are trying to spread them into the air, like say on a mountaintop, again, check the wind direction first.
Mm-hmm. As my uncle found out with my grandmother, it's not a really fine powder.
No.
It's not all a really fine powder. Expect diversity in size and consistency.
And specifically, my family does not have experience with the plane or the mountaintop process, but what my family has done is spreading ashes at a beach into the ocean. And in that case, the way that you do it is you wait for lower tide. It doesn't have to be absolutely low tide, but like fairly low tide. You go very close to the water, but not actually in the water, obviously. You dig a hole in the sand of a couple feet deep if you can, but like at least say 18 inches deep and say a foot on each side. And then you pour the ashes into the hole, and then you spread a little extra sand on top, and then you back up. And you, with your family members, you stand there and you wait for the water to come up, and the water will wash away the sand on top and then will eventually wash the ashes out into the ocean. And that is
That's
how you spread
lovely.
ashes at the beach without accidentally horrifying the small children who are playing in the water within 20 feet of you. Because most people at a beach will back off a little bit if there are, say, 10 or 15 people dressed in nice clothes standing in a very mournful half circle facing the ocean. And they will
Yeah.
not decide to send their toddlers screaming into that section of the beach trying to build sandcastle. But I have heard horror stories of the many ways that that can go wrong. So
Oh, yeah.
it worked out very nicely for us.
Yeah. Also, make sure that you actually look up laws and know
Yes.
which ones you want to break and how you're going to break them. Because,
Yeah, there are
like,
beaches that actually don't allow that kind of thing, and sometimes it's for very good reasons.
and like, you're not supposed to spread ashes in the ocean unless it's in international waters. Like, those sorts of things where there are like restrictions on what you can and cannot do, and most people ignore them, but also some people don't.
Sure. Well, and I'm not sure about that international water thing because there are definitely states that have barely any rules at all about disposing of cremains. Like, there are lots of very specific rules about disposing of bodies that have been, like, embalmed or not, but with cremains, North Carolina has almost no laws at all about that.
Okay,
So,
so North Carolina notwithstanding, a lot of
sure.
states have
Yes.
laws and regulations about it. So make sure you check on that. Also, a way to not horrify loved ones slash onlookers, if you have a jar or something with the cremains that you're going to spread, don't stick your hand in it to grab
No.
the
No, that's not how that
ashes.
works.
Like, no, just don't. That's not necessary and it's not appropriate.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Yeah. Another like form of burial ish, but caring for the dead is in mausoleums. So it's kind of entombing someone. You'll find them in like New Orleans has them. Recoleta Cemetery in Buenos Aires has them. There are a lot of places that have them, especially places that are pretty low in elevation. And that's because in areas with higher water tables or where they're literally under sea level, such
Yeah.
as New Orleans, you can't bury people in the ground because, as we discovered in our wells episode, if
Yes.
you dig where water is, it'll just keep getting filled. And so, if you bury people, you might bury them at low tide, but it's not always low tide. And if there's lots of rain or those sorts of things, then bodies can actually sometimes float up out of the ground, and that's where zombies come from.
Well, not in
Which,
the real world, but also, like, speaking of horrifying your onlookers, so,
but that's like that's one of the
where
places
the old rumors, yeah.
where zombies, like the lore around zombies
Yeah.
and vampires, comes from. I learned it by doing a haunted tour in New Orleans when I was there for Churchwide Assembly in 2016. It was delightful. We learned a lot about mausoleums and like what happens in mausoleums and why people get buried. Like, they would bury people in walls, and then in the course of a year, the body would decompose, and then you just kind of sweep away the remains to make room for the next one. But sometimes people would go back and the body would be gone. And so then there would be, that's like
Awkward.
how lore around vampires came to
Yes.
be, of like that vampires were the dead awake again. And the same is the case for like mausoleums. And I mean, Recoleta Cemetery is literally called the City of the Dead, but there's like little houses for different families. And then you kind of just like more or less rotate. And so, like, as people are buried and then decompose, then eventually there's usually a drain in the middle. And so, eventually, like, once they've decomposed as much as they're going to into like dirt and dust, then you sweep it into the drain. And that space is a space for a new person in the family to be
Sure.
laid to rest. So, yeah, highly recommend haunted tours if you were ever in New Orleans. It's a million
And if you're
percent worth
into
it.
that thing and not afraid of ghosts.
Well, yeah, that too. If you are afraid of ghosts, then you should probably not check out our new season of Horror Nerds at Church, which is our ghost season and is going to be awesome. And we're going to explore all sorts of things about ghosties and death and some of the tropes around them.
Sure.
Speaking of which, one of the more common tropes in horror ghost movies in particular is the idea of a place being built on a native burial ground. this is a harmful trope. So
Racism.
yeah, I know when I was a kid, we did a day camp in the summer with like the rec organization in town. And we'd go up on the mountain and like hike around and that sort of a thing because I lived in the mountains. And they had, with Camp Vale, they had like on Vale Mountain all of these like different ways that like kids could engage and like have fun and like do make believe stuff. And they had that where it was like accessible by ski, snowboard in the wintertime and then accessible on foot in the summertime. And we definitely, I remember vividly having a part of that be talking about like native burial practices and like people being buried high up in trees, which may be a burial practice of native people somewhere, but is
Sure.
not the practice of the Ute, who were the original inhabitants of those mountains, the mountains that were called the Shining Mountains, which I love. They did not bury people up high in trees. And it makes sense that that would like not necessarily be the most logical place to bury people because it's very exposed to the elements and to animals that can fly or climb trees that
And
might
would take a
then
fair amount of work to get the
take
body
on.
up there in the first place.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
What the Ute are most likely what was common practice kind of pre colonization was that the Ute would bury their dead in caves or crevices or shallow graves more secretly. So they wouldn't like mark it and they'd wrap them maybe in a blanket and take them to that place on horseback or something like that. They wouldn't have permanent markers, but they would likely remember where they had buried that person. So they would remember the, like, based on just the natural markers that are there. There's also the Ute made use of trees. And so there are a few different types of trees and with different purposes. And one of them was called a burial tree. And not everybody who was buried or who died was associated with the burial trees, but the medicine people for the tribe would carry cedar seeds from cedar trees. And
Hmm.
when a medicine person or a chief died, then these seeds would be planted nearby. And so then there's just this like association between cedar trees and spirituality and like a spiritual
Sure.
connection with them.
And I kind of wonder if there's a connection there between maybe there was a misunderstanding that led to the idea of being buried in a tree rather
Maybe,
than.
maybe. I hadn't thought of that. It's possible. But one of the cool things from the article I read that we'll link to is cedar is actually, and we know this like in scripture, the cedars of Lebanon, right? Cedar actually across a lot of different cultures has a spiritual connection. So it's kind of cool to see the things that cross multiple cultures and multiple practices without having actually been like taught or passed on to them, which is cool.
Yeah. So, what about Christian burial practices, which are obviously the ones that we have the most experience with personally? Well, often in a Christian cemetery, the gravestones will be facing east and the bodies will be buried so that the feet will be toward the east and the head would be on the western side, so that if the person sat up essentially or stood up, they would be facing east. This is based on the idea that
Mm.
when Jesus returns, it will be with the rising sun, and so the dead will be able to face Jesus immediately without having to like turn around or something. Although there is a not 100% followed but fairly common tradition that clergy are buried in the opposite direction, facing their flock, so that at the second coming, when everyone else stands up to see Jesus, the clergy will stand up and see Jesus reflected in the face of their people, which I think is a lovely idea. But also,
Interesting.
these days, a lot of clergy are not actually buried at the same place as, say, their last congregation. So
Yeah.
it was more common when a clergy person, was assigned a congregation and then worked there until they died.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. I have no intention of facing my flock. We're not the shepherds. Jesus is. We're just sheep.
yeah, personally speaking, I don't really have an attachment to the burial practice. I do have an attachment to the funeral practice of facing the opposite direction as a acknowledgement of I've managed to convince them to ordain me. Dang it. Which is at the funeral service rather than in the graveyard itself. But
I love that.
yeah. Yes. Also, many people will realize that Christian graveyards are often separated into Protestant and Catholic cemeteries, or sometimes a graveyard that, like, say, belongs to a city will have a Protestant section and a Catholic section, and there are various traditions around that. This is because some of the rules about burial and blessing the land are slightly different in Catholicism than they are for Protestants. And in particular, a Catholic cemetery will often have an area designated for those who have not been baptized, which are often babies that were stillborn or miscarriages. I have seen that done in beautiful and touching ways, and I have also once memorably seen that done in a very strange way where that area was labeled as Babyland, and it kind of looked like
Oh,
a label for an amusement park, and
I was gonna say that sounds like an amusement park, like
I
Candyland
don't know
style.
who decided that was a good idea, but it seemed odd. But also, I have many times seen the photo of a married couple, one of whom was Catholic and one of whom was Protestant, and the Catholic and Protestant cemeteries were next to each other, and there was a fence between them. And so their gravestones stood up just tall enough so that they were slightly taller than the fence, and they were on either side of the fence right next to each other. And out of each gravestone came a stone hand, and the two hands were clasped. I
Oh
thought
my
that was very
gosh, that's
sweet.
adorable.
Yeah.
My grandparents,
Mhm.
my grandfather was Protestant, my grandmother was Catholic, and my grandmother basically just fought with the Catholic Church until they let her bury him in the Catholic cemetery. And he had his memorial service at the Catholic Church.
Oh yeah, so did my
So
great uncle, who had to be moved because of the sprinklers. Yeah. And then finally, of course, one of these classic ways to offer one's condolences to someone who's lost a loved one is to say that you hope that their loved one rests in peace. And resting in peace is also a common phrase to see on a gravestone in a Christian cemetery. More recently, we've seen the phrase rest in power, which has arisen out of the Black church and Black communities in the United States and was originally used only for those who had died in situations involving injustice. I believe specifically arose out of death by hands of the police. And so that is reserved for those who died in unjust circumstances. And also, even more recently, I've seen that the queer community has been embracing the phrase rest in pride, particularly for
mm-hmm.
those who have died in unjust circumstances. And specifically, most recently, the artwork I've been seeing that says rest in pride is for Brianna Gay, who was killed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's a lot of really powerful things that we say when people die, and a lot of ways that like it becomes platitudes too, of like,
It can, yes.
and so I like when it is modified to give a deeper meaning and to be a deeper
Yes.
connection.
As long as the modification acknowledges and honors the community out of which that modification came from. Because
Yeah.
I've also been seeing people use rest in power for somewhat random people who weren't Black and who didn't die in unjust circumstances, and that's not really okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Agreed. Agreed. So then when we come to Jewish burial practices, there are some other kind of guidelines, and there are more guidelines because Judaism has such a long tradition and history that some of the practices are connected to health and like public health, and some of them are more ritualistic. So in Judaism, cremation and embalming are both highly discouraged. People are buried in like a pine box with a simple shroud rather than the big elaborate coffins that most funeral homes try to sell you. And cemeteries themselves, and this is part of the like public health, cemeteries are always at least a certain distance from the synagogues. So
Sure.
that has to do with like dead bodies being considered unclean. And so anyone who is a priest in Judaism or a descendant of priests would only be able to go to deaths of immediate family members, but wouldn't go to the other more extended deaths because dead bodies are considered unclean. And so
Right.
keeping the cemeteries at a distance from the synagogues helps everybody be able to worship without being made
Yeah.
unclean. Also, it's a way to keep people safe and like if you're worried
Yeah.
about contamination or those sorts of things.
Particularly before we developed germ theory.
Yes. Also, one of the practices in Judaism is that when someone dies, there is a person who stays with the body from death until the body is buried.
It's not always the same person, but
Yeah.
at least one person is with the body until.
And then also part of the like mourning practice, there are kind of two main things. One, if you go to a Jewish cemetery, a lot of times you'll see small stones on the gravestone or piled in different places. That's part of like mourners will come and leave a stone on the gravestone. Also, part of Jewish practice is to sit Shiva with those who are the loved ones of the person who died. So you kind of do the model that's a good model for grief care. Whoever is most impacted is at the center, and then everybody follows their lead, right? So that's what's happening with Mary and Martha in our gospel today is they're sitting Shiva. And so people are sitting with them. And then when they come to meet Jesus, people go with them so that they're not alone in their grief and in their grief practices. And
Yeah.
then the phrase that is most common for Jewish people who have died, which we heard, there's been some pushback for like Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Justice Ginsburg, when she died, a bunch of Christians were like trying to say rest in peace. And Jewish communities were like, actually, no, what we
Please
say
don't.
is, yeah,
Yeah.
what we say is, may their memory be for a blessing.
Yes.
And so that's one of the common things. One of the things that has also become more popular is like, may their memory be for a blessing, may their memory be for resistance. Again, coming out of like justice movements and people
Sure.
who work for justice.
And when it comes to Muslim burial practices, they are pretty well agreed on the idea of not practicing cremation, in part because of how their beliefs about the final resurrection work. And the Islamic world is somewhat divided on the idea of organ transplants. A large part of the Muslim world will agree that organ transplants to save another person's life are fine and welcome, even if not exactly ideal under how their understanding of what happens after death works. But the folks on the subcontinent of India are much less likely to practice organ transplantation. And it is fairly common for only men to attend the actual burial of the body, although there is a funeral service to which women and children are welcome very often. And Islam also practices very quick funerals. There is as little waiting as possible between the time of death and the funeral service itself. There is no visitation or wake or viewing, anything like that, and you usually don't have an open casket.
Usually, I think it's within 24 hours.
Yes. Yeah,
Yep.
ideally speaking. The body is washed and draped, generally speaking, by family members or close friends, and then the service is held usually outside the mosque, either in an outdoor area or in a prayer room. And after the service, followed by the burial, there is a 3-day mourning period. Not entirely dissimilar to sitting Shiva, where the family stays at home. Flowers are sent to the family's home afterwards, and they receive mourners at home. And the grave itself is designed so that it is perpendicular to the direction of Mecca, so that the body placed in the grave without a coffin is lying on its right side, and then it faces Mecca directly. And much as Christians will say rest in peace, or Jewish people will say may their memory be for a blessing, if you want to offer your condolences to a Muslim person, two common things to say are may God have mercy on them, or to God we belong and will return. Of course, traditionally both of these are said in Arabic, and specifically to God we belong and to God we will return is from the Quran itself.
Mm-hmm.
And there are many other phrases used, but those are two of the more common ones.
And then there are as many burial rites and burial practices and customs as there are cultures, and probably
Absolutely.
more than that. But one of the things that is a particular dynamic in a lot of different cultures is the people who take care of bodies of those who have died.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot around that in a variety of different cultures where people, I know pastors have a great and deep appreciation for good funeral home directors and for those who take care of bodies and coordinate all of that. And in Japan, there's this movie that came out in 2008 called Departures, which is a fantastic movie. It won an Oscar the year it came out, I think. And in Departures, the story is about this man who doesn't do well as a cellist and returns home and becomes a nokanshi, and I'm not positive I'm pronouncing it right, but it's a traditional Japanese ritual mortician. So he prepares bodies when they've died. So he cleans them and all of that sort of a thing. And because of prejudice in Japan and like social taboos against people who deal with death, that's like where the conflict happens and stuff. But it's this beautiful movie, and like it's one of those movies, it's a Japanese movie, and so there's just like this beauty and clear simplicity in the movie itself, and I highly recommend it to everybody. But it does such a great job about really exposing like the difficulty of burial and preparation for burial, but also the beauty and the honor and the ritual of it.
Yeah, absolutely. So you know us, and you know that we love to talk about how do our deep dives exist in pop culture. Well, if you have questions about current and popular burial practices, specifically in the US, although also a few things from other nations and cultures, I would definitely suggest that you check out the podcast Ologies, and there are 3 episodes in particular that you'll be interested in. There are 2 episodes on thanatology, which is the study of death.
Not the study of Thanos.
No, no, absolutely not. No snapping.
Although he does contribute to a lot of people's death.
I suppose, yes. For a little while. They come back. It's fine. They get better. But the first thanatology episode is from, I think, quite a few years ago now, like 5 or 6 years. And that does a fairly basic overview, not only of grief and mourning, but also of actual burial practices. And then the second episode is an updated episode of sorts, and actually goes into much more depth and specifics about some of the more recent burial practices that have more recently become popular. And then also she has an episode where she visited the Paris catacombs, and she talks about, as she calls it, I think, metropolitan tomology. And it's a very interesting episode on why the Paris catacombs came to exist and what they're actually like inside.
Interesting, because catacombs are another type of burial that we don't really do in the United States, but was really common in Europe.
They are somewhat similar to mausoleums.
But yeah, it's similar to mausoleums, but a lot of times they're mostly underground and just like built and structured in such a way that like there are like little spaces in the walls where you can like slide in the bodies and they can slowly decay.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. Also where early Christians, went to hide and worship and be protected and stuff. So, all the things. Maybe that's why cemeteries are sometimes considered sacred, because of the connection. I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm making that up. One of the most common places where cemeteries show up in pop culture is, of course, in the TV show Buffy. She's a vampire slayer. So,
every episode?
Right? Like almost every episode, there's a cemetery. A lot of times it's like they're like funny scenes of her just like waiting around for the dead person to like rise as a vampire so they can kill him. But also there are vampires who live in the crypts that are in the cemetery. So there's just lots of it in Buffy if you want to. Yeah. A lot of exposure to it.
In addition, there's the TV show called Miss Fisher's Murder Mysteries from Australia, which I very much enjoyed. There's 3 seasons of that. And in the second episode of the second season, which is called Death Comes Knocking, a major plot point and a fair amount of the episode actually happen in a cemetery. It's a above-ground cemetery, much like Louisiana, although I don't think that they explain it's because of the water table, because they live in a fairly dry area. So it must have been for other reasons.
There's a lot of places that did it back in the day because you could bury lots of people in a smaller area.
Right. Yeah, and it is a family tomb that is part of the story, which is desecrated and items are stolen from it. And to be fair, in some places I imagine it is easier to build a small structure on top of the ground instead of digging down into the ground. And there are also a couple additional episodes of the TV series that focus specifically on pyramids, because the sister of the main character was apparently killed by a guy who was slightly obsessed with the Egyptians. So,
pyramids, another way that people are buried.
Yes. Although not very many people.
No. Just the main fancy ones.
Yes.
Yeah. And then Coco takes place primarily in the land of the dead, but also in the cemetery. And that's the way that Miguel gets to the land of the dead. But that's based in Mexican culture and the Day of the Dead tradition, and that space of being in relationship with families and having altars and all sorts of things. It's wonderful and great music, and I love it.
Sure. Speaking of music, and Also, flashing back to a shared episode with Horror Nerds at Church, you may have seen the movie Hocus Pocus from the 90s, which involves a cemetery taking a fair amount of the plot, and several scenes happen there. And the
Mhm.
cemetery is, of course, characterized as sacred ground, and that means some very special things for the story.
It's true. It's true. It's a plot point for
Yes.
sure. And then in space, right? They have to figure out how to take care of dead bodies. And in the TV show Foundation, what they do is mostly just like send them out into outer space. They'll still usually put them in something like a coffin, but
A container of sorts.
yeah, unless they're like just trying to kill them, in which case they don't need to be that respectful. And then they'll like let them out the airlocks usually.
And then from the TV show Lost, in the fourth episode of the first season called Walkabout, in that episode, after having crash landed on an island in an airplane, that is the episode where they burn the plane fuselage with the dead bodies in it in order to keep, frankly, animals from getting into it because the bodies are starting to decay. And so they burn the plane fuselage. And as a part of that, there is an extended conversation between two characters, Jack and Saeed, about how if there were Muslims on the plane who had died, they would not want to be cremated as a part of their religious practice. And Jack is very agreeable to that, but also points out that they can't actually know who was Muslim because it's not like any of the paperwork would say that. And they really don't have the people to take all of the bodies out and bury them. So
Yeah. And then Lord of the Rings, it wouldn't be a Nerds at Church episode if I didn't mention Lord of the Rings because it's been a while. But in Lord of the Rings, we get a couple different ways of burying people, all of them in Gondor, or for the stewards of Gondor. But Boromir gets a version of burial at sea. So they put his body in one of the boats that they were using with his horn and like all his stuff, and then let it go as it floats along the river. And then also, the steward of Gondor then tries to kill his other son, but kind of thinks that the son's already dead, but just won't hear anything, and so is doing like
Denethor isn't paying attention to a lot of things, to be
it's
fair.
true, it's true, and does more of a like funeral pyre, burn the dead thing, and actually ends up becoming a ball of fire that runs off of the top of the
I believe in the
castle
book
during the
that
war.
part is not quite as dramatic.
Okay, it's very dramatic in the movies,
In the
though.
movie,
I don't
yes.
remember the books that well. Yeah. So, I mean, burial and graveyards and those sorts of things come up all the time in pop culture. And it's fascinating to me to think about how different authors and different stories actually convey it because there's such a diversity in how people experience it and in what people do and what meaning making happens for the creators in that process, and then like what meaning making happens for those of us who are reading or watching or listening to those stories.
Yeah. Our first reading for this episode is from Ezekiel chapter 37, verses 1 through 14. God gives the prophet Ezekiel a vision of a valley of dry bones, which come to life, and explains that this is a metaphor for the new life God will give the people of Israel.
So, one of the themes in this passage is another type of graveyard, which is a battlefield. So, it is definitely commonly understood that this Valley of Dry Bones is at least a graveyard, if not a battlefield, where the people of Israel have lost a battle. And so, whenever I read this, I always think about Gettysburg, and there's a Lutheran seminary there that I have never been to, but I always hear stories of hauntings and all sorts of things about Gettysburg. And so I just like imagine that if I went to Gettysburg, it would just be like ghosts everywhere, kind of Sixth Sense style. Probably because I watched that this morning for Horror Nerds at Church, but like just ghosts like walking around, little pearly sights and all of that stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have not been either, although I know several people who have gone to the Lutheran seminary right next door to the battlefield, and from what I hear, I'm not going to absolutely say that it's haunted, but like there are reasons why a lot of people think it's haunted.
It is true. We also, in college, we had buildings that were haunted too. But I think it's more
Wartburg just
likely
had
in
bats.
places where you know a lot of death happens. Well, there's that. One of the buildings on Luther's campus, if it burns down one more time, nobody's ever allowed to build there again.
Oh my goodness. Have they considered not building the building out of wood?
Yeah, it's built out of brick right now. But like
Okay.
if like there's some Iowa code or something that if a building burns down
Oh,
like
college.
3
Okay.
times, you can't build it back the fourth time.
Huh. Okay.
That's weird. Anyway, as we dive into the verses, we read in verse 3, God says to Ezekiel, "Mortal, can these bones live?" And Ezekiel answers, "Oh Lord God, you know." And it feels like TV show reboot questions, right? Like, can the bones of Doctor Who live? Yes, we have discovered that they can, in fact, live. Can the bones of Gilmore Girls or Full House? No. No, they should not have ever made those reboots. Let the dead live. Yep. I will stake my claim on that one. And then in verse 6, God is talking to these bones of the people of Israel and says, "I will lay sinews on you and will cause flesh to come upon you and cover you with skin and put breath in you, and you shall live, and you shall know that I am the everlasting." And my immediate reaction was to think about the reverse process of this, which is maybe not a great idea, but is also like what Willow does at the end of the 6th season of Buffy to this one guy who's been awful and has killed her beloved, and so she's like racked with grief and becomes
Yeah.
violent and like strips him of his skin and then the flesh, and
Yeah.
yeah, that's horror. But also this could be horror if it were like the skeleton cab driver in Halloween Town, right? So Halloween Town, which is a
Is the
Disney
Disney movie.
movies, but the taxi driver is a skeleton, and so he would probably find it horrific if God tried to lay sinews on him and cause flesh to come upon him and cover him with skin. And yeah,
Yeah, that would, yeah, yikes.
so perspective.
And then in verse 7 we read, "So I prophesied as I had been commanded, and as I prophesied, suddenly there was a noise, a rattling, and the bones came together, bone to its bone." And as I read this, I could not help but immediately think of the famous, well-known song Monster Mash. And so, in case you're wondering, that one came out in 1962, and it topped the Billboard charts just before Halloween that year. It came out a few months before Halloween, but it topped the Billboard charts specifically right as Halloween happened.
Mm-hmm.
And it was written by Bobby Boris Pickett, who grew up watching a lot of horror films because his dad managed the local movie theater, and it turns out that the idea for the song came from one time while he was performing with his band called The Cordials. He, for reasons that would take a while to explain, did a Boris Karloff impression while performing, and it was quite the hit. Apparently he was really good at it, and so that led eventually to him writing the song The Monster Mash and focusing on like Halloween-like songs for a little while. Yeah.
I don't know who Boris Karloff is, but that sounds cool.
Boris Karloff is definitely famous for playing Frankenstein's monster specifically, and
Okay.
had a very specific face shape, sort of, that meant that he often played monsters in very old, classic black and white movies. Yeah.
Yeah. Now I think I know who we're talking about.
Right. And then in verse 12 we read, "Therefore prophesy, and say to them, Thus says the Lord God, I am going to open your graves, and bring you up from your graves, O my people, and I will bring you back to the land of Israel." And as I read about opening up graves, I thought that I wanted to share a tip with anybody who's into D&D that I've discovered recently, which is that if you're playing D&D as a death-focused character who can cast spells, and there are like 3 or 4 different ways you can do this with the various classes and such, I would strongly suggest, if you're able to do it, get a hold of the cantrip Mold Earth. A cantrip is a very basic spell that you can cast at any time, and this particular cantrip lets you move up to 125 cubic feet of earth or stone, although not fast enough to injure someone, so you can't like throw the dirt at somebody and hurt them with it, but you can move the earth. And you also can't like move it out from under someone fast enough that they would immediately drop into the hole, because believe me, I asked that question. And so no, that's not true either. But what you can do, however, is to use the spell to, say, dig a grave with the flick of a finger, as 3 feet wide by 6 feet long by 6 feet deep is less than 125 cubic feet.
Uh-huh.
And
That is
it
true.
turns out that being able to dig a quick grave without having to do a lot of the backbreaking upper body strength building work is both, handy for someone who is death focused and maybe like works at a temple or something, but also like if you happen to be interrogating someone and you need to intimidate them. Let me tell you, the first time I did that, my DM did not even make me roll an intimidation check. He was so impressed. My character
Nice.
looked the guy in the face and said, "Are you really sure you're telling us the truth?" And flicked my finger so that a grave opened up right next to us. And the DM just said, "Okay, yeah, no," he immediately tells you. And that was fabulous. And also, if you are running away from something scary, you can very quickly make difficult terrain behind you by digging a bunch of graves as you go, because hopping over a
Hmm.
grave does take a little effort. And so if you just make a bunch of graves behind you as you go, especially if you're like in a tunnel or on a path and it's like
Mm.
difficult to leave the path because it's difficult terrain around the path, that is super helpful.
I'm here for mold earth. You could also just
Yes.
like do a like 2 feet by a longer distance and just have it be like upturned and like
Sure.
all
Yeah,
sorts of fun stuff.
as I continue to play with this character who is death focused, she is a divine soul sorcerer that works for the god of death. She also has the spell Maximilian's Earthen Grasp, which has a hand come out of dirt or stone and grab somebody. And so the
Hmm.
way she does it, it looks like it's coming out from a grave.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yep.
yeah, you can play with a lot of
Makes
things like
sense.
that.
Yeah. Speaking of flesh,
Mhm.
our second reading for this episode is Romans chapter 8, verses 6 through 11. Paul reminds us that as Christians, our lives are centered not in our flesh, but in the Spirit of God that dwells in each of us. So, one of the themes in this passage is the idea of a spirit dwelling inside bodies, which is a lot like the spirit of Raymat in An Ember in the Ashes, which is placed inside these 100 people at the beginning of when the scholars did a bad thing. And then all of their descendants continue to have that spirit of Raymat in them. But
Hmm.
it's dormant for a while until someone wakes the spirit.
Oops.
Well, maybe, maybe not. You'll have to wait until we get to verse 10 to find out. And then as we dive into the verses, in verse 6, we read, "To set the mind on the flesh is death, but to set the mind on the spirit is life and peace." And particularly given the ways that a certain author just keeps digging herself deeper and deeper into literally advocating for genocide, this verse, as I read it, I was like, this feels like affirmation of trans people and a call to listen to and to set the
Sure.
mind on spirit, right? That it's not just about the bodies we were born into, but the spirit and what is life and
Yeah.
peace for us.
And maybe especially don't focus on your neighbor's flesh, your neighbor's
Yeah.
body. Like, that's just rude.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
In verse 7, we read, "For this reason, the mind that is set on the flesh is hostile to God. It does not submit to God's law. Indeed, it cannot." And in a very practical sense, this is certainly absolutely true, because when you're focused on the survival of your flesh, your body, not dying, then you very often can't focus on God or on God's law, because the survival instinct just sort of takes over when you are at the brink. And this
Mm-hmm.
is especially seen clearly in the Hunger Games and similar dystopias that force people to the very edges of survival.
Yeah. It's true. It's true.
Yeah. So, yeah, you don't necessarily have to see this passage as some kind of end of life
Antibody.
threat.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, or some kind of threat about the afterlife. This is also just very practically true.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure, for sure. And then in verse 10, we read, "But if Christ is in you, though the body is dead because of sin, the spirit is life because of righteousness." And this is where Raymond's spirit is in Laya. Is the main protagonist. And Raymond's spirit in Laya is life. And Laya is, in fact, spoilers, the one who wakens Raymond's spirit by resisting the Nightbringer. And so the Raymond spirit in Laya is life and is doing her best to be in right relationship, to be righteous, and to care for all of creation, including the Nightbringer, but also including all of the humans that he is trying to destroy.
Yeah.
Yay, Raymond.
And then in verse 11a, we read, "If the Spirit of God who raised Jesus from the dead dwells in you." All right, so please remember that this is the Holy Spirit being within a person, such as when the Holy Spirit welcomes us in baptism, rather than, say, being possessed by a non-corporeal being. Much as the Firefly episode Objects in Space that spent a while trying to convince us that the character River was non-corporeally possessing a spaceship, that episode was a good time. That's not actually something that, happens very often, probably, as far as we're concerned, in real life.
Yeah.
Mostly.
But if you want to know more about being possessed, you can definitely check out Horror Nerds at Church's upcoming season on ghosts, Ghostbusters, and all things spooktacular.
Sure.
Also, hashtag shameless plug.
And our gospel reading for this episode is from John chapter 11, verses 1 through 45. Jesus hears that his friend Lazarus, brother of Mary and Martha, has become ill, and arrives at their home not long after he has died. After grieving his death with the sisters, Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead.
So one of the themes in this passage is some kick-butt women.
Yes.
So this story has Mary and Martha, two kick-butt women, and just so you know, they are so awesome that in fact, they're not actually real. So they used to be one person. Mary used to be the only character in this story, and Martha was added in because scribes, probably men, couldn't handle one woman being so awesome and important to Jesus. And so there's early manuscripts where it says Mary, and then there's and her sister Martha kind of thing, which Elizabeth Schrader discovered and wrote a paper about, and then Diana Butler Bass popularized a lot last year in a lecture that she did. So we'll link to the article and the sermon/lecture for you, but it's a really cool and relatively new piece of biblical interpretation and a reminder that women are awesome and Mary's awesome. And this is just for the Mary and Martha that is in the Gospel of John. The one in the Gospel of Luke is a different story. Literally a different story.
Exactly. Yeah. And probably different people because they are in a different direction from Jerusalem, if I remember correctly.
Yeah,
that Mary and Martha, it specifies at one point or another which direction they're both in, and that Mary and Martha, you have to leave Jerusalem going a different direction to get to.
I believe you. And then in verse 2 we read, Mary was the one who anointed the Lord, that is Jesus, with perfume and wiped his feet with her hair. Her brother Lazarus was ill. And this is too blunt to be foreshadowing because in fact she has not yet anointed Jesus with perfume and wiped his feet with her hair. That actually comes after this story and perhaps as a response to what Jesus does in this story. So it's not foreshadowing. Maybe it's just plain old spoilers, sweetie, to borrow a phrase from River Song.
Yeah. In verse 9a, we read, Jesus answered, "Are there not 12 hours of daylight? Well, if you need more proof that Jesus did not live in the United States, especially not the northern part of the United States, here you go, folks. Because while it is not quite the Matrix up here when clouds permanently blocked out the sun in that movie, but it can feel like that sometimes, even if we're not just talking about sunshine. No, Jesus, there are not always 12 hours of daylight. Sometimes there's a significantly less amount of daylight, in fact, on a fairly regular basis, and don't even get me started on daylight savings time. So,
oh my gosh, it's the worst. It happened this week, y'all, because we're recording this the week before it's airing. It was awful.
Everyone's least favorite Sunday of the year that isn't actually a church holiday.
Yeah. We just need to stop doing that altogether. It's awful. Yeah.
And then in verse 14 we read, Then Jesus told them plainly, Lazarus is dead. And I am very much a use the word to say the thing kind of person, and I was trained to say that a person has died or is dead rather than that they have passed away, and certainly do not ever, under any circumstances, use the they went to sleep metaphor with kids. That is a bad thing that will lead to their parents hating you because their children refuse to go to sleep, mysteriously.
Or God needed more angels, or they're waiting for you. Or one of my friends uses expired. The person
That
has
one kind of
expired.
works,
It
but
kind of
also,
works, but
like, don't make them
also
sound like milk that went out of date. Yeah. And you don't want the other person convinced that the person who has died might only be mostly dead, as they put it in Princess Bride. If you have to paraphrase, like, just steal a couple of lines from the dead parrot sketch from Monty Python. They are an ex whatever, and so be it. They are very clear in that sketch that the parrot is extremely dead.
Yeah. I'm glad that you talked about that, because when I was reading through the passage again, I was like, Jesus, don't say that he's sleeping. He is not sleeping. He is dead. Euphemisms for death are not helpful, especially for kids, but like in general. Clearly, Jesus uses euphemisms all the time. And at some point, he's got to learn that, like, it didn't work with Nicodemus. It confused the Samaritan woman at the well. It confuses his disciples with Lazarus. Like, speak plainly at some point, Jesus, please.
Sure.
Speaking of, in verse 43, Jesus has come to Lazarus's tomb and tells him to roll the stone away. And then Jesus prays. And then when he had prayed, he cried with a loud voice, Lazarus, come out. I can't not. Hashtag
I
too
can
queer to
literally
function.
see the rainbows from here. Yes.
Right? Like, and I love this passage because there is so much about closets and being closeted and closeting yourself, like whether it's a choice, forced, whatever, that is so death dealing, to the extent that, like, sometimes it does result in death. But like, this passage gives such a good way of talking about what it means to come out. And it's like, as a queer person, as a trans person, right now in the United States, like, coming out is the only way that we have of combating the death of closets, because nothing is working. It is like people are trying to eradicate us, and being present, being visible, not allowing them to erase our identities and ourselves from public is part of how we resist and how we push back against that and say, no, you know what? Jesus told me to come out of the death dealing and to come out. So that's what I'm going to do. End of Emily's mini sermon. And now for our most everlasting segment, except for, the part where it's the shortest segment of all of our segments, because we just started it last year. Yeah.
It's clearly not going to die anytime soon.
That's for sure. Let's make a Muppets musical. Kay,
Yay.
What have you got for us today?
Well, so I think both of us were having a little trouble coming up with something for this one because we were, so focused on cemeteries and graveyards. And as we talked, I was starting to think about who from the Muppets would make a good cemetery keeper, groundskeeper, or graveyard keeper, because it is such an unusual job. And very often they're not expected to be like super sociable, but you do have to have some awareness and like respect for other people, because you're constantly like, every time you go to your job, you may encounter grieving people. And so I was thinking about who would be good at that kind of job. And also you have to like being outdoors, or at least not hate it. And there's a fair amount of physical work in the job, even if you are using machines to actually move most of the dirt around these days, if you are doing burials underground instead of above ground. And there are certainly a lot of laws to know. And so when it comes to someone who's capable of being reasonably somber and polite on a moment's notice, I think Rolf actually would be pretty good at that. And also, because he does spend so much time at the piano, I'm sure he has a lot of hand strength, and that would possibly lead to some upper body strength, so he might be able to handle the labor involved in the job as necessary. And he just seems like, I was mostly thinking, though, if I accidentally had to run into a Muppet at a cemetery while I was grieving a loved one, I think Rolf would be very comforting to run into. So.
Yeah. I was thinking maybe Snuffleupagus.
Oh, and he could hold the shovel to dig the graves with his trunk. Yeah, that's very sweet too.
Yeah, I think Snuffleupagus is the comfort that I would want to accompany me if I were grieving a loved one. So I also, so then that is like, what if, like, okay, hear me out. Then the question becomes, in the gospel, if we were to cast the gospel, I think like having the Muppets be part of the like group of people sitting Shiva with Mary and Martha would be actually like this really beautiful thing, because you'd get like
Sure.
all these different Muppets sitting Shiva. And so they're all like following Mary and Martha's lead, but they also at the same time are doing it in their own way, right? Where like
Yes.
when they want to weep and rage, Animal is there to like bang on drums with them. And when
Sure.
they just want to like snuggle up with a pint of Ben and Jerry's, Snuffleupagus is there.
Yeah. And also, Muppets would be especially nice to grieve with because they always seem like they're so good at hugs, and they are,
Mm-hmm.
made out of nice soft cloth and a little squishy. And so they must be very pleasant to be around for physical comfort. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us. Catch us next time when we'll discuss nerdery connections to the scripture readings for Palm Sunday, or also known as Passion Sunday. This podcast has been produced by us, Kay Rohloff and Emily Ewing. For more fun, check us out on Twitter and Facebook at Nerds at Church, or contact us at nerdsatchurch@gmail.com.
Also, if you like what you've heard, rate us or leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Facebook, or wherever you catch your podcasts. If you want access to our uncut guest episodes and interviews, live Q&As, and more, support us on Patreon at patreon.com/nerdsatchurch. It's definitely cheaper than buying a burial plot.
Yes.
And more
Or
fun.
even just a burial side plot?
Or even just like the gravestone. Any part of the burial funeral process.
Yes. No, I was going for plot versus side plot as in storytelling pun.
I love it. Yes. Yes.
And let us know on Facebook or Twitter who you would cast for Let's Make a Muppets musical for this episode.
As the ancient Christian said,
Pax
Pax
Vobiscum.
Vobiscum.